Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, CEO of IoT One, and our guest today is Ted Harrington, Executive Partner of Independent Security Evaluators. Independent Security Evaluators is an ethical hacking firm that identifies and resolves security vulnerabilities. In this talk, we discuss the IoT cybersecurity attack surface and best practices for securing IoT products. We also explored the steps systems operators and end users can take to ensure that their systems remain secure as they progress through their digital transformation. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, please email us at team@iot1.com. Thank you. Ted, thank you for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Ted, before we get kicked off into our conversation of IoT security, I want to do a bit of a deep dive into your background because you actually have quite an interesting background. I think you actually graduated in psychology. I actually did my undergrad in philosophy and also somehow ended up in a similar area. How did you make it from there now to the executive partner of Independent Security Evaluators? What was it that led you towards the cybersecurity track?
Yeah, I've just always been an entrepreneur on the path to entrepreneurship my whole life. And actually, it's funny you even mentioned very few people actually ask about my degree because it was a long time ago. But the reason that I even studied psychology was for two reasons. One, because I wanted to understand how people think. And two, I didn't know it at the time, but it was going to wind up being such a centrally important part of my career in security, which is fundamentally, that's the absolute core of everything that we teach and we talk about and we preach is you have to think like an attacker. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of someone else, understand what motivates them, how they make decisions. And so in an unexpected way, that very unrelated undergraduate degree serves me tremendously today.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, right? So it's not so much the technical challenges, but it's thinking through from the hacker perspective, and I guess also from the end user perspective, right? What are the mistakes that an end user would make, the ways they might use the technology that would leave them vulnerable to a breach? So I suppose it's quite important to have that perspective. Just the technical know-how is not kind of sufficient to secure an environment.
I've found really interesting over the many years of doing this is to find that why systems get broken. There's obviously a long laundry list of technical reasons, but the fundamental common thread that weaves throughout all of them is assumptions. People who build things assume that people who use things will or won't use them in certain ways. They will do this or they'll never do that. And what winds up happening is that attackers, they actually look at those things that a normal person wouldn't do. They try to find those things and do them the opposite way. And it's pretty funny. I'm in conference rooms, boardrooms all the time with companies who will be walking them through their attack model, right? And we'll be able to say, okay, well, what if someone did X? And people will literally say in response to that question, they'll say, oh, well, no one would think to do X. And I'm like, I literally just did. And I just asked you about it. So if I thought of it, someone else has too. And that kind of stuff, happens all the time. And so those assumptions are really one of the things that is woven throughout so many of security challenges today.
Interesting. Okay. And then you set up this company, Independent Security Evaluators, in 2012. What was it about that timing? Was it, was it just the right group of people coming together? Was it that you saw some particular need in the market? What led you then to set up the company?
At that point, I was running a different technology company. I was actually in a different sector. I was in water. And my now business partner, he reached out to a friend of his that he went to the PhD program with at Johns Hopkins. And I knew that guy as well through a friend of mine from Georgetown, where I went to school. And what was going on was that I was sort of looking for maybe some different type of the next stage of my career. And my business partner was looking for somebody to help him who had essentially the kind of capabilities that I had. And so he had actually started the company about maybe like, I can't remember exactly. I was about 6 years prior to that. And so we basically decided together to restart this company. He had already decided he wanted to restart it. And so together, that's what we set out to do, was to take this company that had succeeded and had some really amazing customers, but had really just not gone anywhere in terms of its, growth and success. And we said, hey, there's something here. There's a lot of people need this service. And we said, let's do it. And, you look at the world in 2012 and people really need what we wound up doing, which is, and what we are doing, which is, companies need to find their vulnerabilities, right? They need to find somebody who can help them understand how an attacker will break their system. And that's what we do. And it's pretty fun because people pay us, we're the good guys who get to do the bad guy stuff, and we get to do the hacking and not go to jail.
Yeah, right. So you get to be asked to do all the devilish deeds, but do it on behalf of the company itself. That's kind of quite interesting, right? Can you give us a couple background stats on what has been the evolution of, whether we're talking about the amount of money at stake, the amount, the number of hacks, whatever that might be. What's been the evolution from a kind of a top-down perspective of the cybersecurity threat over the past decade or so?
Well, it's definitely changing. Your question is spot on that the attack landscape is definitely evolving, and it will forever evolve because of something that will always be inherent to the human spirit, which is innovation. And so as companies are continuing to innovate and develop new solutions, fundamentally those, as those innovations play out in technology, that's going to change the way that a system can be attacked. And so some of the changes that I've seen over the past several years is one in particular is that companies now are starting to warm up to the idea of what security researchers and what ethical hackers like us can do for them. All the way back to, let's say, if you rewound like 20 years ago, the way that companies related to security researchers was to sue them. They really didn't like receiving, these findings of research. And now there's more formalized programs to work with companies, and there's still a long way to go. I have quite a few stories I could tell you of kind of dumb things that companies do still, but that's improving. And so that's, I think, one really big thing. But the other really big thing is, as we look at the way that companies are changing their relationship with technology and how business benefits are being delivered, and I'm saying business benefits, but I also mean the business of delivering benefits even to consumers, whether that's you serve consumers or you serve other businesses, but is that this move to software and the move to applications as the way to essentially drive businesses. And that's why I wrote this book, which I'm sure we'll talk about here today. But I wrote a book that's called Hackable, and it's all about how to do application security right, because I see that as really that's the future of technology. And in fact, we already live in that future, but it's only going to become more and more part of the way that pretty much everything operates is software. And so figuring out today how to secure that, that's the center of the mission. We got to get that right.
I love your synopsis here of Hackable, right? Some of the challenges of security, right? Security hurts UX and design. Security slows development. Change is endless. Security isn't your job. There's all these reasons not to properly invest in security because you're focused on getting the functionality to your customer as quickly as possible so you could win that market. And then when you get into these hypotheticals about, if we don't invest in security, we could have some hypothetical challenge down the road. It's kind of intuitive that this can be a challenging topic for companies to prioritize, especially for younger, kind of startup or high growth companies that have so much pressure from their investors. But it's like anything. It's like insurance to an extent, right? I mean, put your seatbelt on. You might only get in a crash once every 20 years. But when you do get in that crash, you want that seatbelt to be on. So I imagine a lot of your job is also having this conversation. I mean, maybe we can get into the details a little bit of the company Independent Security Evaluators. But a good starting point would be, who are you talking to? Are you talking more to the large scale multinationals? Are you talking to the high growth startups that are bringing products to market? And then at those organizations, are you talking to a dedicated organization for security or the IT function? Or are you talking to the product teams that might have a lot of other conflicting priorities, but trying to educate them about how they can build security and without necessarily sacrificing on these other priorities?
Well, I'm going to start by challenging you on the way that you just framed security as like insurance. And it's really interesting to me to hear you say that, because you're not alone. A lot of people actually make that comparison. The very first words in chapter 1 of my book are literally,
security is not insurance.
No, security is not like insurance.
Okay, that's great.
And then I go on to describe why not. And essentially the premise is that, insurance doesn't prevent bad things. Security does prevent bad things. Insurance doesn't necessarily deliver benefits along the way, and security is tremendously beneficial along the way. Instead, I think security is actually more like fitness. What you put in is what you get out. When you do it right, you join a community of enthusiasts. It makes you look better and feel better, and others are attracted to you. But it's hard, and not everyone will make it a priority. And so that's my tangent before answering your question. No, security is not like insurance. Your question about who we work with in terms of company size and then the people within the companies. So the kinds of companies who would typically hire, they range from funded startups all the way through to, like Fortune 10 size companies. And they all have the same problems, the same security problems in terms of needing to find their vulnerabilities and fix them. But their business problems sometimes vary a little bit. As I'm sure know, the larger enterprises, there's usually a lot more bureaucracy and red tape and a lot of just dumb things that get in the way of doing security right. But smaller businesses, even that are funded, they have challenges too, where they're like, I could go out of business in 3 months if we run out of money. So I have to really think about this investment in a different way. Then within the company who's hiring us, that depends. The larger enterprises, it might be, there are some of our customers who have literally security departments that are bigger than our entire company, just their internal security team that hire us. And we have for a security consulting company, we're pretty big. We're like today about 50 people. Most types of companies who do what we do are much smaller. It's like a talented person or a handful. And then obviously, as you move into a smaller company, we might be dealing with the CEO in some cases, but that's generally who are the kinds of people who we're working with. But they all sort of share the same commonality, which is that technology is a business driver and their customers need them to make sure it's secure. And so we help them do 2 things. We help them, number 1, secure it, and then number 2, prove it. And that's actually the core premise of the book that I wrote, which, there's the first 9 chapters are here's how you have to secure it. And then chapter 10 is if you did those things, only if you did those, but if you did those things, here's how you actually prove it to your customers.
So I guess the prove it aspect, I assume there's a technical part of that, right? You have to somehow demonstrate that it's been proved, but there's also a strong communication aspect of that. You have to communicate that value proposition. Do you get involved in both of those, or are you more on the how to technically prove that you've secured it?
So it's actually both of those things. You need to be able to communicate the technical proof. And so essentially what we do is our process, we'll help our customers find vulnerabilities, including, most importantly, the custom exploits and the really unexpected things. And I can, share a couple stories about that. Then we advise them how to fix it. They fix it. And then once it's been fixed, we verify that it actually is fixed. And now that's when we give them their deliverables, which is, reports, or we can even join meetings with them if needed, but essentially give them the materials so they can go to their customer and to say, look how seriously we actually take security. Everyone else says we take security seriously. They use a lot of words and they say we're highly secure and all this just garbage that really isn't anything related to actually being secure. They're like, I'll show it to you. And so that's essentially what we give to them. But then ultimately it's up to them to be able to prove it to their customer.
I imagine for the first years of the company, you were focused primarily on internet-related topics, and of course, this podcast is a bit more related to IoT. So when we bring the internet down to the physical world, what does that look like for you today? I assume the majority of your business is still on more pure internet applications, but how has this this kind of evolution of IoT impacted your business? Are you already servicing companies in the space? If so, what are the types of asset classes that you've dealt with, or the types of device categories that you've dealt with before?
I'd argue actually that IoT is in fact application security, because to operate a device, right, you need to interact with it through a piece of software. If we go back to, it was about 2014, there's a really famous security research conference called DEF CON. And DEF CON is where like all the coolest new research comes out. And because we're always publishing research, we had some relationships there, and they approached us and asked us to do this little event for them. And they said, bring some routers, and because we had just published some research that showed how we could hack all these routers. And they said, can you bring it and somehow make that experiential? And so we said, sure. So we showed up, and this first year we were in, imagine a big hotel conference room or, convention space. And then as you get into like the smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller rooms, and then there's always that one room in the back that's like crazy small. So we're in that room, in the back of that room with a bunch of like other people in the way, literally behind a trash can. They placed the trash can right in front of our table. And we're like, okay, well, I guess we're going to try to change some hearts and minds with this thing that is like so the literal definition of the back corner of this conference. But it went well. So that year it went well. And we started talking with DEF CON after that about maybe expanding the footprint. And that next year we launched this idea that's called IoT Village. And IoT Village is essentially this hands-on hacking experience for IoT. And so what we wound up doing is we wound up bringing in different manufacturers to bring their devices, and we had speakers, and we built all these different contests, like a capture the flag style contest and a 0-day hunting contest, which is where you try to find new vulnerabilities. And then each year after that, it just kept getting bigger and better and more badass. And, fast forward to, this year live events are not happening, but, fast forward to last summer, and it was like the Taj Mahal of these events within the event, this IoT Village was, and we had all kinds of people. By this point, IoT Village has represented the discovery of more than 300 0-day vulnerabilities, which is issues that were previously unknown in these different devices that now the manufacturers knew about and could potentially do something with. And I think the creme de la creme, like sort of the crowning part of all of this was when DEF CON has this part of their culture where they give out what's called a black badge to to people who do something super awesome, super badass. They'll give them a black badge. And black badge it's kind of like the security community's equivalent of the Hall of Fame jacket. And so our contest is so well regarded in this community. We're talking like thousands of people playing this thing over the years, that our contest has awarded the black badge, which is like people rarely get it, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And that's like the highest honor happened 3 times. And so, within our community, everyone's like pretty jazzed about that. So the reason I'm telling sort of that story arc of going from behind the trash can to being, really king of the mountain in some senses. I don't mean that we're better than other villages at DEF CON, but just we had achieved the level of success with it we wanted. The reason I'm mentioning that is because in that journey, we really got exposed to pretty much every aspect of IoT security in terms of not just, is it a device issue? Is it a hardware issue or a software issue? But also, what are the business constraints behind it? How is it different for a consumer device versus a medical device? How do security researchers work with these companies? And why do many of these IoT companies have difficulty working with researchers? And so we've really kind of seen it all. And it's just been a wild ride for sure.
For some reason, I have this story in mind where you hacked the iPhone. Is that right? I feel like I read that somewhere.
Yeah, we were the first company to hack the iPhone. That story is so funny. It's my business partner. He's always like, "Why are we telling that story?" Because at this point, it's like 13 years old. But everyone that we tell it to, outside of like our close circle within the security community, they're like, "You guys were the first ones to hack the iPhone?" And that story is kind of funny. If we can rewind in our mind's eye to when the iPhone was first going to come out, just imagine, just remember how transformational that was, right? It was the day before, there was no such thing as a smartphone in your pocket. And then the next day there was. That's societal shifting. And we knew that was what the impact was going to be of this device, or we anticipated that was what the impact was going to be. And so we really wanted one. And part of the reason we wanted one was because they're awesome. Like with everybody else, it's just cool. We want one, right? But the other reason, and probably the main reason, was we wanted to hack it. But the problem was, so did every other security researcher. Anyone who was looking at this type of situation, everyone wanted to get their hands on it and wanted to be first. And so the problem was, though, not only were we competing with other researchers, but we couldn't get any advantage, right? Apple was completely tight-lipped about what the new system might entail. We couldn't get our hands on a pre-release device. We couldn't even skip the line, right? We had to camp out like every other fanatic to get one. And so what we needed to do was we said, we need to create an advantage. And so what we did is we thought the way that a lot of attackers think, right? Is they say, okay, well, can I maybe consider how business practices might influence development practices? And in this case, we said, well, as Apple moves from a desktop to a mobile world, might they carry over some unresolved vulnerabilities? So we were able to research those vulnerabilities, and we were able to build in advance some attack scenarios around that. Then the iPhone comes out. We started with that sort of theory in mind that we felt like other researchers might not be anticipating. And sure enough, the hypothesis, our theory, proved to be true. And we wound up finding what's called a buffer overflow vulnerability, which essentially resulted in us taking full administrative control of the device. So how we proved concept was, we were working with a reporter from the New York Times, and our lab was in Baltimore, 200 miles away. From our lab in Baltimore, we took over the New York Times reporter's phone sitting on his desk in Manhattan and started showing him how we could delete text messages or send text messages. We could fire up the camera and take pictures. And now he was part of this research. We weren't like exploiting an unwitting victim. But of course, that helped him write the story. And New York Times is who ultimately was the first person to break that story. And that's how we achieved our goal, which was to, be first. But that's not where the story ends, because ultimately the whole point of security research is to make things better, right? And that's true about for our customers too, right? Anyone who hires us or any research that we do of investing our own resources, the whole point is to just make things better. It's not to be a jerk. It's not to embarrass anybody. Although some researchers, I think, actually do those sometimes, unfortunately, but that's really not the point. It's to make it better. And so once we found this issue, we were able to report it to Apple. And to their credit, I'm telling you, man, it was, I think, 48 hours. They had issued a patch, and this issue was now completely eradicated. And some people don't like Apple. Some people are obsessed with Apple. But whichever side of the fence that you're on, that's the way that companies need to think about security, right? Is that it's about getting better, and you got to find your issues. You got to fix them, because it's not about just building good products. It's about building secure products.
Yeah, well, Apple's certainly one of the best in terms of security and just responding. Let's go back to this topic of, I think you're right to kind of push back that IoT security is application security. It's just that you have a different set of interfaces. You have a different kind of compute constraints on the devices, which maybe limits to some extent, how you build security in. And then you mentioned that you look at IoT security from the perspective of different situations. So what are the requirements of a medical device versus a consumer device, maybe versus an industrial application? Can you kind of walk us through, if you are encountering a new category, I'd say a new product or new a solution that a client is paying you to assess, what's kind of the checklist of, before you get into actually conducting that assessment, what's the checklist that you'll mentally walk through to say, okay, what are the things that we have to consider for this particular category? How would you start to assess? Where do we start? What's the scope of the assessment that we have to conduct on this particular IoT solution?
That's a good question for sure. So every process starts with an exercise that's called threat modeling. And essentially what threat modeling is I like to think of threat modeling as like a scouting report against whatever the opposing team is in whatever sport you like playing, and whether that's American football or whatever it is, baseball, whatever you play, there's this idea of scouting reports where one team will evaluate the other team to understand their strengths and their weaknesses and come up with a game plan. And that's kind of what threat modeling is like. And so what happens in threat modeling is you essentially try to understand three things. Number one, what are you trying to protect? Those are your assets. So that would be, is it data such as personally identifiable information? Is it corporate intelligence? Like what is it? Or is it intangibles like reputation of the brand? Or it might be availability of the service. Some of them those more intangible things. So what do you want to protect? The second question is, who do you want to defend against? And so that will be exploring, are we talking about nation states, organized crime, hacktivists, casual hackers? How does the insider threat fit into all of this? And the reason that you think about each of those as individual groups is that they're motivated differently. They have different skills, different resources. And depending on what your assets are, they're going to have different reasons why they might want to come after your company. And then the third part of a threat model is to understand your attack surfaces. So this would be, where will the system be attacked? So once you go through that exercise, and that's something that we would typically do directly with any of the companies who hire us, we'll walk through that with them. But even if we're doing research, and so we're not now directly working with the company, because when you do research, usually the company doesn't even know that it's happening, let alone participate in it. We're making some assumptions about what it might protect and why an attacker might be interested in that. But once you've done all those things, now you can start thinking about misuse and abuse cases. And so that's really what any sort of security testing comes down to, is how can you take the combination of these things? What does it protect? Who's it defend against? And where will it be attacked? And then try to abuse those different attack surfaces. So that's always where we start. And then from there, it just depends on what the system is. Should we be talking about admin interfaces? Is there, in the case of IoT, certainly an attack surface is any sort of physical access to it. Is the device like the use case of deploying IoT devices in a hotel room that's like guarantee owned, because an attacker can just rent the hotel room and then attack the device because they can plug into it, and then every other guest after that is owned. So those are sort of the kinds of things that you have to think about.
Let's use one example to dive in a bit deeper here. I think a lot of our audience is coming from the industrial sector somehow, or let's say at least the B2B environment. So if we're thinking from that perspective, so that means that the environment's going to be to some extent controlled by the end user. And then we have this particular set of, let's say we're not talking about a healthcare environment here. So we have a particular set of kind of IP or system security requirements that an enterprise might have. How would you then start to assess this particular environment? And let me know if it's useful. We can even narrow down deeper to a particular a category of products. So maybe that's necessary for you to start thinking through this.
Yeah, let's do that. Why don't we narrow down and focus on something, and I'll live think through what the problem might be.
Okay, so let's think about an AGV in an environment. So this could be in a warehouse, in a factory. It could also be in a hospital or some other care facility. Basically, we have a guided vehicle. It has a decent amount of compute power on it. It's connected to a lot of different. So it has probably its own system that's guiding it, but it probably is connected to other MES systems, ERP, some other type of system that's exchanging data. And then, of course, people also have access to it. So at least the employees do. And I guess in some environments, then other people that are not employees might also have access to this AGV.
I'm not familiar with that acronym. What's an AGV?
Autonomous guided vehicle. So this could be anything from like a, could be like a forklift that's in a warehouse, or it could be a autonomous vacuum cleaner at an airport that's, just running around cleaning up the environment. The airport could be at a hospital. These, in Japan, let's say, kind of service robots that are just acting as, kind of walking screens that communicate information to patients or to other people in hospitality environments. So basically we have some kind of mobile equipment that is 100% automated.
Okay. And the perspective you're interested in is the company who's deploying that solution as opposed to the company who has built that and sold that solution.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say to think about with that is that in this type of scenario that we just laid out, there is a shared responsibility model. So, and I see this, I refer to it as deferral of risk. I see deferral of risk happen all the time. This is what deferral of risk looks like, right? Where the person, the company who makes that AGV, they say, well, it's incumbent upon our customer to ensure that their network is secured and hardened in these ways. And the company who is licensing or buying this connected device, they say, no, it's the responsibility of the device maker to license or sell us a secured solution. Now, both of them are right that yes, each of the other parties play a critically important role in ensuring that this system works the way that it's supposed to. But where many organizations actually really stumble, and you see this, you mentioned healthcare a moment ago, but it's rampant in healthcare. It's really bad there. I'm sure it's equally bad in other industries too, where it's almost to the point where some organizations completely abdicate responsibility entirely to say, I can secure this as much as I want, but if you don't bring me a secured solution, then how am I going to do anything with that?
Just to follow up there, are they doing that from a legal? Are they actually trying to say we don't have any legal liability because it's, we want to contractually put all of the liability on our product managers or the suppliers? Or are they actually trying to kind of write that into contracts that we have no liability here?
Oh, they're definitely writing it into there is endless legal battles about what security controls are going into the contracts. But what's funny about that is, who really doesn't care at all about the legal clauses? The attacker. They don't care at all who's liable in the event of a breach. So that's why I do think that it's a good idea to approach legally how to require different partners to approach security. Yeah, you want them to do certain things, but you have to realize that that's actually not going to solve the problem. But I don't think that, I hope I wasn't cavalier the way I was presenting it. I didn't mean to say that companies would necessarily say, well, it's no longer my responsibility because I don't want it to be my responsibility. I actually don't think that's true. I think that most companies do truly want to keep themselves secure to whatever extent they can. But I think that a lot of companies feel, to some extent, if not powerless, limited in their power, because they're saying like, well, should I even bother investing tremendously in my network? Or even if I do, let's say I just built, the metaphorical Fort Knox. Well, if I deploy this vulnerable solution, which every single headline about IoT would suggest that IoT solutions have security issues, where does that leave me? And so I think that's a bad thing. That's a bad scenario that there's sometimes an adversarial relationship between supplier and buyer. But I think that really the answer to that is I think there is a positive and bright future to this, which is, and it's probably largely led by the larger companies, to work in more collaborative, in a more collaborative context. Like, let's say you're a very large multi-site type of company and you are a large buyer of startups, hot new technology. Well, instead of trying to scare that startup with all this legal language or whatever, partner with them. Invest some of your engineering resources, even financial resources, to help them get security right, because it benefits both of you. And we actually see that happen in other non-IoT industries. And it's still sort of this misunderstood, not really widely accepted approach, but it's tremendously powerful where people do it.
So I suppose in this environment, right, you have a physical device. A fair number of people have access to it, right? Both maybe employees, and then if it's in a hospitality or a hospital environment, probably non-employees could gain access if they wanted. So you have the device, and then you have the system, the application that's running that device, and then you have other applications that are integrated through to that device. So is there any kind of 80-20 rule where you see the threat landscape? Is it mostly in the application that's running the device? Is it the device itself? Is it third-party applications that are integrated into the device? Or does it just depend on the situation where the threat landscape might be focused?
Well, it definitely depends on the situation, but since you've done a good job of laying out a hypothetical, we'll use this situation. And so this isn't necessarily universal across all situations. So where I think the emphasis should be is on any attack surface that would be accessible from basically anywhere in the world. So what does that remove from scope? So that means that someone who can get, and this is where it's going to maybe sound contradictory, which I will probably it will sound contradictory, but it won't be. The worst case scenario is that someone can get physical access to the device, because in most cases, if you get physical access, it's probably game over. Now, some devices have good anti-tamper, mechanisms and stuff, but the point is that's usually not a good situation. But there's a limited number of people who can do that. So even if you're talking about in this facility, even if it's like 25 people might be able to get physical access to it in some way or another. Okay, well, that's 25 people. But if the application that operates it is accessible to literally billions of people around the world, like that's a much bigger problem. And the barrier for an attacker is much lower. An attacker might not fly to that site to go try to get physical access to this thing rolling around this facility, but they very well may attack from wherever they live in a non-extradition country in order to achieve whatever their gain is. Maybe it's take the system offline and charge, ask for a ransom or something. So if I was to say, hey, you've got X dollars to spend and X is a limited amount of money, I would start with something like that, because that's where your largest pool of attackers are. And if there are issues that can be trivially exploited in that way, you want to tamper those down pretty fast.
I have almost no expertise here, so just maybe I'm asking a question that the answer is simply no. But are integrations ever a serious security concern? Because in an enterprise environment, often you have the application that's running the particular asset or device, and then that might be integrated with 5 different systems, because data needs to be shared, and some of those systems might even have some kind of commandability over this system, or the ability to issue orders and impact how this application runs. Are those a concern, or is the hacker just going to focus on the application itself that's directly operating the device? An MES that might be sending orders through to the AGV software, telling the AGV what to pick up and where. Like, would somebody try to hack the MES because maybe they have a previous vulnerability that they've discovered and then use that? Or would that be a very uncommon situation?
That's exactly how attackers actually operate. If you think back to something like that mega breach that happened to Target, the retailer Target in, again, that was a few years ago when Target got hacked. What you described is exactly what happened, where the attackers, rather than going directly at Target, they went after one of Target's vendors who had elevated trust and access to certain areas in the corporate environment for of target. And so that vendor was, a small company, didn't have effective security controls. They weren't even really a technology company, though they had technology as part of their company, and they were compromised. And then their elevated trust and access is how the attacker was able to get into target's corporate network. And then from there, they were able to pivot over into the payment area. And then that's how they got all those cards. So the way you described it, these integrations, and this is called a stepping stone attack. And the idea of jumping from one thing to the next, that's exactly how attackers work. So no, that's a good question. And maybe you're more of an ethical hacker than you think.
Let's go on to a different topic, which is, so you mentioned earlier that the security landscape is changing. Are we moving into an environment that's more secure, that's generally less secure? And then maybe, based on that answer, you can talk a little bit about where the environment might be more secure, becoming more secure, and where it might be becoming less secure. So how is the attack landscape around IoT devices changing, or IoT systems?
Okay, about IoT, yeah. So I was going to ask a clarifying question, which you just answered, which is, are we talking about IoT or just more generally? So within IoT, some companies are in fact getting better at it. They are definitely in the minority. But what's happening is the proliferation of IoT is expanding so fast. The adoption of all these different connected devices and all these different use cases, from cheap little light bulbs or whatever to autonomous, all kinds of huge, expensive systems. And what I'm seeing is that those companies who are getting better, they are a direct result of all the progress that the security community is helping to, knowledge transfer that's happening to those building things, to people who are building things. So that's a really positive, and I don't want that to get lost in the story, because so much of the narrative about security in IoT is always negative, and mostly it is not good. But there are companies doing it well, and I think those companies, I can't name their names because many of them are our customers, but they deserve to be celebrated, and it at least deserves to be pointed out that companies are doing it right. Unfortunately, because I said, mentioned about the proliferation, there's just such an influx of innovation in IoT, and most of that innovation is really not having security as central to it. And so I actually see, on the whole, if you average across everything, security in IoT is actually getting worse over time because of that rapid adoption without the market forces causing security to be prioritized. And that's unfortunate. And that's why I'm, advocating for stuff like this. That's why I was really happy to come join you on this show. That's why we do IoT Village, because we know that it can get better. We've seen companies do it better. But unfortunately, we're seeing the scale at which companies who are not doing it right increase exponentially. And so that's a precarious situation for an industry in its entirety.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, that it's kind of the velocity of innovation around a particular domain, would have a direct impact on the security. And I guess in IoT, you have a lot of innovation around the algorithms, so machine learning algorithms and kind of data processing, and then you have a lot of innovation around connectivity solutions. Around the core hardware, there's a lot of innovation. So, and then of course just different form factors coming out. So proliferation of products. So I can see how that would create a lot of new opportunities for a hacker to find vulnerabilities. Are there any areas in particular that, whenever you're working with an IoT device customer, that you immediately zero in on and you say, okay, here's the three areas that we know there might be a significant security concern, or is it just too fragmented to have that kind of top three, or that immediate kind of red flag?
So that's a good question. It's maybe hard to answer it directly the way that you asked it, but there is an indirect answer, which is, what are the maybe common issues that companies should be dealing with or thinking about? And the first issue has to do with the leadership. So companies who are building things, if security is not a priority of the leadership, it will not be a priority for anybody else. And I will argue till you're blue in the face with anybody who tries to say that, yeah, but I have a security guy who does that. I have an IT guy who does that. I don't know anything about security, but I hired a guy who hired a guy who hired a guy who's 5 layers beneath me. And yeah, I'm pretty sure we're secure. Never, ever going to happen if it's not your priority. So I think we need to start with leadership realizing that just like every other domain in the business is your responsibility, so too is security. Security is the same as finance. You know, if there was a month or a quarter or a year where you didn't perform financially, your job might be at risk. And we should be thinking that security kind of has that same gravitas to it. Now, it doesn't mean you need to be the expert. It does not mean that you need to know how to break a system. Not at all. But it means that you need to know that this is your job, even if you're not the person doing it, just like finance is your job, even if you're not the person doing the accounting. So number one, leadership. Every company that we've seen runs into that. Number two, the stage at which you think about security. And this is a big one. Most companies don't think about security until way after deployment. They say, let's design the solution, let's build it, let's roll it out, let's see how the market reacts, let's iterate on it, let's think about it in version 2. And what winds up happening when you do that is not only are you deploying vulnerable solutions, but you actually are signing up for a tremendously painful road to fix those issues later. The data shows, we did some research on, analyze our own numbers from our customers based on when they actually perform security or when they started engaging security. And it's 25 times more expensive to do security, to deal with a security vulnerability after deployment for something that was, say, like a requirements or design level issue. So 25 times the number of hours to fix it. That's not writing checks to a consultant. That's not paying me 25 times. You're paying your developers. And it's taking them 25 hours to do something that should have taken them 1. That's enormously impactful to companies, and most companies don't realize that. So leadership is 1. The stage at which you think about security is 2. And then the third, and I know that you were asking for like technical areas within the technology, and I'm not giving you technical answers. It's because, this third piece, which is getting it done right. And in fact, we talked about my book earlier. The whole reason I wrote this book, the subtitle is actually How to Do Application Security Right. And even companies who try to do security right, and there's tons of them, and I'm sure many of your listeners fall in this category where they're like, yeah, man, I pay for annual penetration testing and I do this and I do that. And they can list their initiatives that they do. Those companies usually are doing it wrong. And not because they're stupid, not because they're ignorant, not because they're not trying. In fact, they're doing all the right things. It's the execution that's failing. And most companies don't realize how the execution is failing. That's why I wrote this book, because it's like, man, if people are trying to do it right and they're still doing it wrong, it's like going to the gym. I used fitness as a metaphor earlier. It's like you're going to the gym and you're like, hey, I gotta get stronger in my chest. And so I'm gonna do a bunch of push-ups. And you're not even doing push-ups at all. You're doing sit-ups. Someone's going to be like, that is not going to help you get to your goal. Your goal is to have a stronger chest. You're not even touching your chest. People are like, but I'm at the gym. Isn't this the right thing? And it's no, the execution is really, really what matters. So those are the 3 things that I would definitely recommend. As far as like, where do the issues commonly arise? That depends largely on different systems, their use cases, their threat models, et cetera.
Okay, no, but I think those are useful answers, and I can appreciate that it would be challenging to give a top 3 given the quite broad attack surface here. So I know we want to do a couple deep dives into actual cases. Is there one kind of top of mind that you can walk us through, kind of end to end, from first contact with the client through detecting and then resolving that security issue?
Why don't I share one from research, because I can talk about some of the details. So we did a study that took, it was quite a lengthy study. We're focusing in healthcare, and we were looking at medical devices. And what we're really interested in was, how could attackers cause harm or fatality to patients? And that was something we saw wasn't really studied very well in healthcare, because people were really studying more like privacy of information, for example, as opposed to patient safety. So first thing that we did was we reached out to a bunch of hospitals and we said, hey, here's what we want to do. We want to hack some of your medical devices. And needless to say, most of those calls were not returned. So it took like 6 months, I think, to get a few hospitals on board. We wound up getting about a dozen across the United States to say, yeah, we want to do that because they care about patient safety. And because frankly, we were going to be giving them, a few $100,000 worth of free work. We said, hey, just give us access. You won't pay for any of it. We just want to be able to publish it. So then once we had organizations we could work with, we started with, of course, threat modeling, like I was describing before. And in particular, we were threat modeling around patient monitors, which are the devices that go by the bedside to report the vital signs for the patient. So once we had completed the threat modeling exercise, then we started exploring the different attack surfaces. And one of the things that we found that we could do to this particular device was that we could bypass authentication, which essentially meant authentication is like logging in, right? So there's a technique where we could get past that, and all of a sudden we could be interacting with the device without any credentials. So that's pretty bad. But where it got catastrophic was where we found that you could perform what's called a remote code execution. And so remote code execution essentially says that from not at the device, I can actually send instructions to the device and make the device do whatever I want it to do. And so we talked before about, what's the 80-20 rule? Where's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is someone being able to do something like this. From anywhere in the world, they can issue a command and the device will respond. So the combination of these two things we found meant that an attacker from anywhere in the world didn't need any credentials. They could make the patient monitor do what they wanted it to do. So from a research perspective, that was interesting because it's not supposed to happen that way. But from an impact perspective, it raised the question, does this matter? Okay, so we can mess with the patient monitor, but it's not attached to the patient. So why is this significant? So then we started expanding on the different attack scenarios. Well, what could you do with that? And there were two really precarious scenarios that exist. So one is triggering false alarms. So this meant that we could make the patient monitor say that this otherwise stable patient is having a cardiac event. Now, a few things happen when all those alarms go off. I don't know if you've been in a hospital ever, but there's all these alarms that will signal nurses to come from the nurse station to the patient's room. So one bad side to that is, of course, that distracts nurses from patients who need care to this patient who does not need care. So that's the best case scenario, is we wasted their time and drew care from someone who needed it. Worse, though, would be, let's say that there was some sort of rush or they didn't follow certain safety protocols. The patient was maybe non-responsive and they just administered the electric paddles. Now, there's safety mechanisms in place so that wouldn't be their first inclination, but in a busy healthcare setting, it's not out of the realm of possibility that would happen. And if you administer electric paddles to a patient who doesn't need it, that's going to really hurt or potentially kill that patient. So that was the first scenario, triggering false alarms. As bad as that is, the opposite scenario is even worse, and that's disabling false alarms. So that would be where a patient does need care, goes into that cardiac event, and it doesn't signal the nurse station. And so now you've got a patient suffering who, time is of the essence when you have something like that. The patient needs that care, doesn't get the intervention. That's going to hurt or potentially kill that patient. There's not regular rounds that they do, but if the timing of the rounds don't line up with when the patient needs care, patient's out of luck. And so so that's sort of the impact of these issues. And so then the next step was to summarize the issues, actually report them back to the organizations that were impacted, both the medical device manufacturer and the hospital, articulate to them how to remediate these issues. And then it's on them ultimately to fix it. And we've never actually gotten them to tell us whether they fixed the issues or not. So I'm going to assume they didn't. because they would be proud to say like, hey, we fixed it. Do you want to come just like double check that we did it right? So unfortunately, I hate to say that I probably don't think they fixed it, and that was essentially the end of it. So in that case, that was research, and you can actually go download that study. It's called Hacking Hospitals. It's on our website. I believe the URL is ise.io/hospital hack or something like that. Or any of your audience can email me and I'll send that to them. And so you can actually read all the details about how we did that.
Yeah, we'll put that link in the show notes so people can track it there. Cool. Any other cases you'd like to share with us?
Well, maybe I can leave you with one last one. I'll leave you with one last IoT story. And this was actually the origin story of how our company, ultimately got its beginning. And the reason I'm telling this story is it's just cool. It's just a fun story. So this is back in 2005. My business partner and a few of his colleagues were in the PhD program at Johns Hopkins. And they heard about this system that's called the immobilizer system. The immobilizer system is an anti-theft mechanism in automobiles. And essentially, the idea of it is that you've got your key, and if you ever wondered why your key has some bulk to it, like it's more than just like the metal piece you would insert, that's because there's a chip in that key, and that chip communicates with the computer on board in the vehicle. And the immobilizer system essentially is there to make sure that it's the authentic key. So you could present a key, and if it's not the authentic key, the immobilizer system will immobilize the vehicle. It will actually make it not work. Well, that system was considered to be unhackable. It was just widely stated that it couldn't be defeated. And Steve and his partners, his buddies, they said, challenge accepted. Let's go see about this claim. And so they set out to go study this. And it took a few weeks to reverse engineer the cryptographic algorithm, a few more weeks to build a weaponized software radio. And then a few weeks later, they were proving concept by starting a Ford Escape without the authentic key, just with this weaponized software radio and a mechanical copy. It shouldn't have worked. And that was a cool moment. Certainly launched our company because when they published the research, everyone wrote about it, because that would be cool research today, but that was happening when people weren't publishing research like that, many years ago. And so companies came calling and they said, "Hey, we have our challenges. Can you help us?" And so that's the company's never looked back. But the funny and final, I guess, outcome to that story was when we reported it to Ford. They didn't actually believe us. And I mean, we sent them the write-up, all the technical summary. We sent them a video, literally us doing it. So we're on this phone call with them, and they're saying, yeah, I mean, that's cool that you guys did that, but there's a little more to it than that. And the reason I'm telling this part of the story is that's a pretty common belief that people have about their systems, especially intelligent people who build sophisticated systems, which I would imagine many of your customers fall into that category. They're intelligent and they build cool things. And people who are like that often can become blinded to what they don't know. And I don't mean to say that any of your members of your audience are necessarily blinded, but these people we were dealing with were very smart and were definitely blinded. And they kept saying there's more to it than that. And we're like, didn't we show you this video? Didn't you read this thing? And it turns out we said, wait a minute. Are you talking about, and we asked them about this trivial bit, little piece of error correcting code. It was like 40 bits. It was super small. It was such an insignificant part of the research that I don't even think it had more than maybe one sentence in the study. We're saying, you're not talking about that, are you? And they say, hold please. And they put the phone on the hold. And what followed was what Steve refers to as his favorite 5 minutes of silence in his life. Well, they obviously were on the other end saying, oh man, these guys hacked our car. And then they came back and they said, all right, we're coming to Baltimore tomorrow.
Oh, that's great. Well, this market is probably going to keep you and a lot of other companies busy. Once we start seeing some self-driving vehicles properly on the road, everybody, I guess the hackers and the white hats are going to have a lot of fun and stay very busy trying to keep us all safe. So you guys have an early head start on this market. Ted, yeah, really appreciate you taking the time to walk through this with us. just a last question from my side is, what is the best way for folks in our audience who want to learn more about what you're doing and maybe look at it, whether you can help them? What's the best way for them to reach out either to you or to your team?
Yeah, so I'd suggest three things. Number one, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very, very active. I'll respond to any of your DMs or whatever. So Ted Harrington, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's easy. Number two is you can email me. My email address is super easy. It's just Ted, TED, at ise.io. So that's like independent security evaluators.io, ISE. And then the third thing is read my book. You can go to hackablebook.com, join the wait list. It's coming out very, very soon. And pretty much everything that I advocate is in there. And then, of course, that's another way through that website you can contact me. So, and I will respond any way that you guys contact me. So happy to help however I can.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@iot1.com.